You thought I'd trust you? $200,000 is a lot of money. We're gonna have to earn it.
The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is remembered as one of the greatest westerns ever filmed, but behind the dusty streets and unforgettable soundtrack was pure chaos. Actors nearly lost their lives, a multi-million-dollar set was blown to pieces by accident, and the entire story itself was made up on the spot just to win over a Hollywood studio. What happened behind the camera was sometimes more dangerous, more shocking, and more unbelievable than anything you see on screen. Today, we're uncovering the strange and untold stories that turned this movie from a gamble into a legend. Eli Wallach, the man who brought Tuco to life, didn't just act out danger on screen, he lived it. Not once, but 3 separate times, he came terrifyingly close to losing his life during filming. The first brush with disaster came in the simplest, most careless way. A technician left a bottle of acid on set, acid that was being used to weaken props. It was stored in a soda bottle, sitting right next to Wallach's drinking water. Without thinking, he took a gulp. Within seconds, his mouth burned, filling with sores. Yet he kept filming, pushing through the pain, because production wouldn't stop for him. The second incident was even more frightening. During the hanging scene, Tuco was tied up, hands bound, with a noose around his neck. The horse beneath him panicked when the rope was shot loose, bolting at full speed. Wallach was dragged helplessly across the ground for nearly a kilometer, the rope tight around his throat. If it had been just a little shorter, the stunt could have ended his life on the spot. But the most terrifying moment came on the train tracks. In the scene where Tuco lies in chains waiting for a locomotive to free him, Wallach was inches from death. Nobody realized each train car had iron steps that jutted down dangerously low. If he had lifted his head just a little, even by instinct, those steps would have crushed his skull instantly. The train thundered past, and by some miracle, he survived. Through all of this, director Sergio Leone hardly flinched. Safety was never his priority, realism was. Wallach later admitted that Tuco's unhinged energy came in part from knowing how fragile his situation truly was. The result? One of the most memorable characters in film history, forged in very real danger. But death-defying accidents weren't the only surprises on set. Even the film's story itself was born out of something completely unexpected. You'd think a masterpiece like The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly was the product of years of planning. But the truth is, it was born in a single, improvised conversation. In 1965, Sergio Leone and screenwriter Luciano Vincenzoni sat down with United Artists. The studio wanted to distribute the first 2 films of the Dollars trilogy in America, but they demanded something more: a third film. The problem? Leone had no script, no story, not even a basic concept. Under pressure, Vincenzoni blurted out an idea on the spot: 3 gunmen chasing after hidden gold during the American Civil War. He made it up in minutes, no outline, no notes. The studio loved it. Even the title, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, came almost instantly, more like a flash of inspiration than careful branding. It was supposed to be a quick pitch to keep executives happy. Instead, it became the foundation of one of cinema's greatest films. What started as improvisation turned into legend. But while the story came together almost by accident, the film's most expensive scene nearly ended in disaster. One of the most jaw-dropping scenes in the movie is when Blondie and Tuco destroy a massive bridge to stop soldiers from fighting. Leone wanted it to look as real as possible, so instead of building a miniature, he had the Spanish army construct a full-sized bridge strong enough to support heavy weight. The crew prepared the explosives and waited for Leone's signal. The agreed code word was via, Italian for go. But before the cameras were ready, someone on set casually used the word in a completely unrelated conversation. The demolition team heard it and pressed the trigger. In an instant, the bridge went up in flames in a spectacular explosion, with no cameras rolling to capture it. Leone was furious. The priceless set was gone, and one of the film's biggest moments had just been lost. But here's the twist. The Spanish army felt guilty for the mistake. They actually rebuilt the bridge from scratch, an enormous task, just so Leone could blow it up again. The second attempt went smoothly, and the final cut became one of the most realistic and unforgettable war sequences ever put on film. And while that accident nearly derailed the movie, other filmmakers believed the entire project was doomed from the start. Before production even started, one of Hollywood's greatest directors tried to stop it. Orson Welles, the man behind Citizen Kane, often called the greatest film ever made, warned Sergio Leone that his idea was doomed. When Leone mentioned he wanted to set the story during the American Civil War, Welles shook his head. He didn't mince words. According to him, Civil War films were box office poison. Too grim, too political, and too unrelatable to international audiences. In his eyes, audiences wanted adventure, not history lessons filled with death and division. He practically told Leone he was walking straight into failure. But Leone wasn't interested in safe bets. He saw something in the Civil War no one else was capturing: the chaos, the cruelty, the way ordinary men became pawns in a senseless struggle. And he found his inspiration in the haunting photographs of Matthew Brady, one of the first war photographers in history. Brady's stark black and white images of fallen soldiers, muddy battlefields, and broken men captured the true brutality of war. Leone studied those photos obsessively, using them to design his battle sequences and set pieces. Instead of shying away from violence, Leone leaned into it. He wanted to strip away the romantic image of war and expose it for what it really was: human greed and suffering. This decision set his film apart from the glossy American westerns of the time, which often painted violence as glamorous or heroic. And here's the irony. The very thing Welles believed would sink the film is what made it timeless. By embracing the Civil War setting, Leone gave his story a tragic weight, grounding the hunt for gold in a backdrop of pointless destruction. It wasn't just three men chasing treasure, it was three survivors navigating a world gone mad. Audiences didn't just watch a Western, they saw greed, war, betrayal, and survival woven into a single story. Leone had gambled against Orson Welles' advice and won. But Leone wasn't just rewriting the rules of storytelling. Even the way the film sounded was unlike anything audiences had ever heard before. If you've ever watched The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, you know the sound before the story even begins, that eerie, spine-chilling howl that echoes across the desert. It's one of the most iconic openings in film history, a sound that instantly transports you to a lawless frontier. But here's the twist. It wasn't a wolf at all. Composer Ennio Morricone, Leone's closest collaborator, was a genius who didn't believe in simply making music for movies. He believed in creating soundscapes and visible characters that guided the audience's emotions. For this film, he wanted the opening to feel primitive, haunting, almost animalistic. But when he tested real wolf recordings, nothing felt right. The sound was too familiar, too natural. So he did something no one expected. He brought two singers into the studio and asked them to howl. Not words, not lyrics, just raw vowel sounds. One sang a piercing A, the other stretched out an E, both in falsetto, their voices cracking at the edges. Morricone layered the two tracks together, added echo, and created something otherworldly. What audiences thought was a wolf was, in fact, two human beings pretending to be one. And that wasn't his only trick. Morricone went even further, assigning instruments to each of the film's main characters as if they each had their own musical identity. Blondie, the good, was represented by a soft, almost angelic flute light and calculating. Angel Eyes, the bad, had the eerie tones of an ocarina, an ancient wind instrument that sounded cold and hollow, perfect for a ruthless killer. And Tuco, the ugly, he didn't get an instrument at all. He was represented by the human voice, sometimes laughing, sometimes screaming, sometimes howling like an animal. A perfect reflection of his chaotic, unpredictable nature. By doing this, Morricone blurred the line between music and character. You didn't just watch Blondie on screen, you heard him through the flute. You didn't just fear Angel Eyes, his presence crept into your ears through that chilling ocarina. And Tuco's manic energy never stopped because his very sound was alive, human, and untamed. This approach was revolutionary. Most films at the time treated soundtracks as background decoration. Morricone made the soundtrack a living, breathing part of the story. The howl at the beginning wasn't just a sound, it was a signal that this movie would break every rule of what a Western was supposed to be. That opening howl has since become one of the most imitated and parodied sounds in pop culture. From cartoons to commercials, it instantly conjures images of dusty showdowns and desert landscapes. But few people know the truth, that it was never a wolf at all. It was human voices, raw, wild, and unforgettable. But while the music elevated the film into legend, not everyone in the cast was thrilled with how things were going, especially its biggest star. By the time The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly went into production, Clint Eastwood was already becoming the face of Sergio Leone's westerns. He had built the image of the mysterious man with no name across two films, and audiences couldn't imagine anyone else in the role. But behind the scenes, Eastwood was growing restless and almost walked away for good. In A Fistful of Dollars, he was the undeniable star, the center of every frame. In For a Few Dollars More, he had to share the spotlight with Lee Van Cleef, but he still carried much of the story's weight. Then came the third film, and suddenly, Eastwood felt his importance slipping away. This wasn't a story about one hero anymore, it was about three men. Worse, Eastwood noticed his character, Blondie, had fewer lines, less screen time, and nowhere near the eccentric personality that Eli Wallach brought to Tuco. Eastwood complained openly to Leone, half joking but half serious. In the first film, I was the star. In the second, there were two of us. Now there are three. If this continues, the next one will have me acting with the entire U.S. cavalry. It wasn't just about ego. Eastwood believed Leone was reshaping the films in a way that left him standing in the shadows. And he wasn't wrong. Wallach's Tuco stole almost every scene he was in. Funny, dangerous, unpredictable. Eastwood's Blondie, calm and stoic, seemed restrained in comparison. For a Hollywood actor trying to cement his leading man reputation, it felt like being sidelined. At one point, Eastwood seriously considered walking away from the trilogy altogether. Leone knew he couldn't risk losing his star, especially since United Artists demanded Eastwood's involvement for the film to even move forward. So, the producers sweetened the deal. Eastwood was offered $250,000, a staggering fee compared to what he'd earned for the earlier films, plus 10% of the profits, and, to top it off, a brand new Ferrari. The money and perks convinced him to stay, but the relationship between Eastwood and Leone was never the same. Eastwood respected Leone's vision, but resented his obsessive directing style, which often meant endless retakes and long hours for small details. By the end of filming, the tension was so thick that Eastwood vowed never to work with Leone again. And true to his word, he turned down Leone's next project, Once Upon a Time in the West, a role that eventually went to Charles Bronson. It's a strange twist of fate. Eastwood became a Hollywood legend, largely thanks to Leone's films, yet he left their partnership bitter and exhausted. Without Leone, Eastwood might never have become a star. Without Eastwood, Leone's westerns might never have reached the same iconic status. But like Blondie himself, Eastwood walked away without looking back. And Eastwood wasn't the only actor torn about joining Leone's wild vision. One of Hollywood's toughest stars was offered not one but two key roles, and said no to both. When we look back at The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, it feels impossible to imagine anyone other than Clint Eastwood, Lee Van Cleef, and Eli Wallach in their roles. Blondie, Angel Eyes, and Tuco feel permanent, like they were destined to exist exactly as they do. But casting this film was anything but smooth. In fact, it was nearly a completely different movie. The biggest what if came from Charles Bronson. Known for his tough, silent demeanor and sharp presence, Bronson was personally approached by Sergio Leone. Leone believed Bronson would be perfect for the cold-blooded Angel Eyes. His piercing eyes and rugged look practically screamed villain, but Bronson turned him down. He was already committed to filming The Dirty Dozen, a war movie that would launch him into stardom. Not willing to give up, Leone offered Bronson another role, Tuco, the fast-talking, unpredictable outlaw. But Bronson hated it. He found Tuco loud, comedic, even ridiculous compared to the stoic roles he usually played. He flat-out rejected the idea, telling Leone he had no interest in portraying such a wild character. Leone was disappointed, but fate had other plans. With Bronson gone, Lee Van Cleef stepped into the role of Angel Eyes. Van Cleef had been a struggling actor before Leone cast him in for a few dollars more, but here he cemented himself as one of cinema's great villains. Meanwhile, Eli Wallach, who Bronson dismissed as too over-the-top, delivered a performance so charismatic, so alive, that Tuco nearly stole the entire movie. In hindsight, Bronson's refusals might have been the best thing that ever happened to the film. Wallach's manic energy and Van Cleef's icy menace perfectly balanced Eastwood's quiet intensity. Together, the trio became iconic. It's hard to imagine Bronson serious, stone-faced, and humorless, bringing Tuco's bizarre, manic charm to life. Still, the story highlights just how fragile casting decisions can be. A single yes or no can change the fate of a movie forever. If Bronson had accepted, we might be talking about a very different film today, one that lacked the strange, unforgettable chemistry that made the good, the bad, and the ugly legendary. But Leone didn't just gamble with his casting choices. Sometimes, he even gambled with fate itself, releasing chaos onto the set just to see what would happen. Some of the most unforgettable moments in the good, the bad, and the ugly weren't even planned. Sergio Leone, notorious for pushing his cast to extremes, sometimes added chaos on purpose, and nowhere is this clearer than in the film's final act. Take the scene where Tuco races through the massive cemetery, desperately searching for the grave that holds the hidden gold. Leone wasn't satisfied with Eli Wallach's performance. To him, it felt too polished, too acted. Tuco wasn't supposed to look rehearsed. He was supposed to look desperate, wild, like a man possessed by greed. So Leone pulled a trick. Without telling anyone, he released a stray dog onto the set. As Wallach sprinted across the gravestones, suddenly a dog bolted into frame, cutting across his path. Wallach flinched, his reaction raw and unplanned, but he kept running. Leone loved it. That tiny burst of unpredictability, a startled glance, a break in rhythm, gave the scene the authenticity he was craving. Viewers thought it was all part of the plan. In reality, it was pure chaos, staged by a director who believed accidents made the best art. But the real star of that final act wasn't the dog, it was the cemetery itself. Leone didn't want just another dusty graveyard. He wanted a stage, a battlefield, an arena for his 3 gunfighters to face off. Inspired by the grandeur of ancient Roman amphitheaters, he had the set designed in a massive circular shape, complete with thousands of graves arranged with geometric precision. And here's the kicker: it wasn't built by Hollywood carpenters. Leone convinced the Spanish army to do it. Hundreds of soldiers were ordered to dig, hammer, and place thousands of wooden crosses into the ground, shaping the cemetery into a perfect circle. The result was breathtaking, a vast arena of death that felt both terrifying and mythic. Leone mapped the space carefully, planning where the actors would stand, where the cameras would sweep, and where Morricone's music would soar. It was more than a set. It was a cathedral of violence, where the final standoff between Blondie, Tuco, and Angel Eyes would play out like a gladiator duel. That cemetery has since become one of cinema's most iconic locations. For years, it was abandoned, overgrown, and forgotten until fans rediscovered it and began painstakingly restoring it back to its original glory. Today, you can still visit Sad Hill Cemetery in Spain, walking the same circle where history's most famous showdown was filmed. But for all the meticulous design and brilliance, the film wasn't flawless. In fact, some mistakes, big ones, slipped right through, and audiences are still spotting them to this day. When people talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly, they usually focus on its brilliance, the acting, the music, the epic visuals. But hidden within all that greatness are mistakes so obvious it's almost funny that they made it into the final cut. Let's start with the trailer. Before the movie even hit theaters, its first impression was wrong. The characters were mislabeled. Tuco, the ugly, was listed as the bad, and Angel Eyes, the bad, was called the ugly. For audiences seeing the trailer for the first time, it was confusing. Was the movie mixing up its own characters? Was it a translation mistake? Either way, it made the film look sloppy before it even premiered. Then came the dubbing. If you've ever watched the English version, you've probably noticed it. The lip movements don't always match the words. Sometimes the lines come too early, other times too late. It's almost like the dialogue was stitched together after the fact, because that's exactly what happened. Leone had a strange directing habit. He often played Morricone's music on set while filming, blasting it so the actors could move and perform in rhythm with the score. It created incredible energy on screen, but it meant there was no usable dialogue recorded. Every single line had to be dubbed later. The problem? The cast was multilingual. Eastwood and Van Cleef spoke English. Wallach spoke French. Many supporting actors spoke Italian or Spanish. In the dubbing booth, everything was stitched together into different languages, and the result was a patchwork that never synced quite right. Critics called it sloppy. Audiences, strangely, grew to love it. The imperfect dubbing became part of the movie's gritty, off-kilter charm. And then there's the most infamous blooper of all: the car. Yes, a car in the middle of the American Civil War. During the sweeping cemetery scene, when the camera pans wide to show the massive graveyard, look closely in the distance. On the horizon, you can see a small vehicle moving across the landscape. A 20th century car, intruding on an 1860s battlefield. How did it happen? Simple. The movie was filmed in Spain, in an area not far from modern roads and towns. A local car must have driven through the background during filming, and nobody noticed, or if they did, Leone didn't care. He was so focused on the faces, the music, and the tension that he probably figured no one would spot it. But audiences did, and the blooper has lived on ever since. These mistakes didn't ruin the film. If anything, they made it more human. A masterpiece, yes, but one that carried the fingerprints of rushed editing, chaotic sets, and imperfect production. And strangely enough, that imperfection became part of its myth. But while fans embraced those quirks, critics at the time weren't nearly as forgiving. It's hard to believe now, but when the good, the bad, and the ugly first hit theaters in 1966, critics weren't impressed. In fact, many absolutely hated it. The Los Angeles Times dismissed it with a brutal headline, calling it the bad, the dull, and the interminable. The New York Times complained about its violence, its slow pacing, and its 3-hour runtime, saying it dragged on forever. To them, it wasn't art. It was indulgence, a violent spaghetti western that took itself too seriously. And that wasn't unusual. At the time, spaghetti westerns, Italian-made westerns, were considered cheap knockoffs compared to Hollywood productions. American critics saw them as lowbrow, overly violent, and far too stylized. Leone's love for close-up shots, exaggerated gunfights, and brutal standoffs was considered tasteless. Even Clint Eastwood, despite becoming the film's star, was dismissed as a wooden actor who lacked the charisma of Hollywood's traditional cowboys. But here's the twist. While critics sneered, audiences were hooked. In Europe and Japan especially, the movie exploded in popularity. Fans loved the rawness, the grit, the tension that Leone stretched to unbearable lengths before unleashing in sudden bursts of violence. They loved Morricone's soundtrack, which didn't just accompany the movie, it defined it. And they loved the moral ambiguity of the characters, where the good wasn't really that good, and the bad wasn't entirely without reason. Over time, the tide turned. What critics once called excessive violence started to be recognized as Leone's way of stripping away the romanticism of war and greed. What they once mocked as slow pacing became praised as masterful tension building, and the soundtrack, once considered experimental and strange, became one of the most celebrated scores in history. The proof of the film's power didn't just come from fans. It came from the filmmakers it inspired. Quentin Tarantino has called it the greatest film ever made, saying it shaped his entire approach to storytelling. Martin Scorsese cited Leone's visual style as an influence on his own. Even Christopher Nolan admitted that when he directed The Dark Knight Rises, he studied Leone's pacing and music to build tension in his final act. And then there's the soundtrack's cultural takeover. Ennio Morricone's theme didn't just stay in the world of cinema. A cover version by Hugo Montenegro climbed all the way to number 2 on the Billboard charts in 1968, something almost unheard of for a movie score. Suddenly, everyone knew the sound of the West, even if they'd never seen the movie. What began as a film critics trashed for being too violent, too long, and too strange, eventually became the gold standard for Westerns. Today, the good, the bad, and the ugly isn't just considered the pinnacle of the genre. It's studied in film schools, quoted in pop culture, and revered as one of the greatest movies ever made. And maybe that's the ultimate irony. What was once dismissed as a disaster became cinema history's crown jewel. Leone didn't just prove his critics wrong. He turned every so-called flaw into the very reason people still talk about the film half a century later. It wasn't just a movie. It was an accident-prone, chaotic, dangerous production that somehow transformed into a masterpiece, and its legacy proves that sometimes the ugliest beginnings create the most unforgettable legends. Looking back, it almost feels impossible that the good, the bad, and the ugly even made it to the finish line. The production was chaos. A lead actor nearly poisoned and almost crushed under a train. A priceless bridge blown up before the cameras rolled. Casting choices that could have changed the entire tone of the film, and constant tension between Sergio Leone and Clint Eastwood. Add to that the strange mistakes, the dubbing issues, the mislabeled trailer, even a car sneaking into the final duel, and it sounds less like the making of a masterpiece and more like the blueprint for a disaster. And yet, somehow, all of those flaws became part of its myth. The danger Eli Wallach faced gave Tuco his raw, unhinged edge. The rushed script, dreamed up in a single meeting, became one of the most enduring stories in Western cinema. The explosion that went wrong gave birth to one of the most spectacularly rebuilt scenes ever filmed. Even the criticisms that once buried the film, its violence, its length, its relentless tension became the very reasons fans worship it today. That's the strange beauty of this movie. It wasn't polished. It wasn't safe. It wasn't even fully planned. But maybe that's why it endures. Because in the end, the good, the bad, and the ugly is more than a Western. It's proof that greatness can come from chaos, that accidents and flaws can be transformed into legends, and that sometimes imperfection is exactly what makes something unforgettable. Half a century later, its echoes are still everywhere in Tarantino's blood-soaked standoffs, in Scorsese's relentless pacing, in Nolan's grand finales, and in the unmistakable whistle of Morricone's theme that still chills the spine. What began as a risky, criticized, almost accidental production has become cinema's ultimate showdown, forever lodged in history as the gold standard of Westerns. So maybe the lesson isn't about perfection at all. Maybe the true legacy of the good, the bad, and the ugly is this: the best stories on screen and behind it are never clean, never safe, and never predictable. They're messy, dangerous, and unforgettable, just like this film.